All right. Hi, Scriven. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. Today's date is April 21st, 2013, and we're here to discuss the Boston bombings. Just before we get started, I wanted to go over two quick ground rules. The first is that right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the recording is completed, we'll be uploading this video to the internet to our YouTube channel. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. And then on top of that, here at Vonvo, we're all about our conversations staying both civil and valuable. We don't want there to be any personal attacks against anyone and anyone who were to join this chat room. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. So let's get our conversation started. Would you mind, just for anyone who watches this video and who might, be listening inside the chat room right now, would you mind just giving a quick background of yourself, where you're from, and why you're passionate about this topic?
Yeah, first of all, my name is Kirby King. I'm a senior Air Force veteran.
Just quickly, Scriven, would you mind just raising your volume up a little bit more? And if you
Yeah,
put,
sure. I'm
if
sorry.
it's okay, if you put your mouse over your screen, there's a little volume icon, and you can raise it there.
There we go. My name is Kirby King. I'm a 10-year veteran of the United States Air Force. I spent the majority of that time in a career field called security forces. It's the military police arm of the Air Force. And facets of how the Air Force protects resources. Um, After that, I did some work as a security consultant for a company. And after that, I moved on to I was an armed patrol officer in Tampa's tougher housing districts. Then after that, I moved to New England and I became a criminal defense investigator. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Security Dialogue, where we discuss a wide range of security topics of interest to our I think 55,000 readers, covering from over 33 countries right now. And so I'm passionate about this, not just because it's been my career for the last 15 years, but also because it's something that I feel I have to care deeply about because the world is changing the way it is. So.
Great. So what exactly, what exactly went through your head after you found out, about these bombings? I mean, can you sort of give us your overall, I guess, personal side of what you were feeling after it happened?
Yeah, my personal feelings regarding the acts, like all Americans, I was pretty upset.
Could you just speak a little bit closer to your microphone again, Scriven? And sorry, it's going out a little bit.
I'm, I'm sorry. I had turned down that volume again. I'm sorry when you were talking with a little bit of echo.
That's okay.
I was saying that, like all Americans, I felt very distraught, and I was very upset by what occurred. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't angry. So.
Right. And so, I mean, ultimately, do you think that you're in the Boston area, correct?
I'm located about 2 hours away from Boston. I go to Boston quite regularly for my job, and I have numerous friends and close associates of mine who work in Boston. One of them is actually a Boston police officer.
Right. So, were you pleased with, and you have a military background, so were you pleased with the handling of, the situation? I mean, the response afterwards, or the fact that, these kids were able to do what they did? I mean, can you tell us what's sort of very concerning, or what you're actually pretty, pleased with in terms of the whole situation itself?
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit on that. There was a lot that I was actually very pleased about. in the Air Force, we often train for this particular scenario, believe it or not. We train a lot with regards to mass casualty incidents. We also rehearse a lot of our law enforcement exercises and drills towards the very worst case scenario, which this was. I was very pleased to see the level of very, very little to any uh, what I would call foul ups or mistakes. The Boston PD and the way they reacted, along with the other emergency management agencies, were absolutely phenomenal. And I believe that their actions saved the lives. I believe that we've learned a lot in the last 12 years regarding how people will react during these incidents. And to be quite honest with you, I was so pleased with the public reaction as I was the first responder reactions as well.
Right. So, what's your take on, what the media is reporting as who these kids are, and the fact that they seem to be normal, individuals in their high schools and schools where they were from, and what's your sort of take on, the whole idea that it sounds like these terrorists were really homegrown? Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that actually. One of the things that I've learned throughout this particular talking with numerous other professionals is that a lot of what the media has speculated about these individuals has proven to be either greatly exaggerated or, in some regards, made up. Um, and that comes from both mainstream media and even social media. Um, uh, what concerns me about these individuals is not necessarily that they were homegrown. It's more the amount of how now they've begun to blend in a lot better. There used to be a time when a guy would hide away, and hide away in a shack or go someplace else different and totally ostracize himself and leave a bunch of clues that something was terribly wrong. These two individuals were very productive members of society, and most of their friends and family members say the things that we classically hear about serial killers, which is that they were such nice guys, and so that kind of concerns me a little bit. You can put a lot of emphasis on facial recognition. You can put a lot of emphasis on better placement of cameras. You can place a lot of different physical security attributes or CCTV attributes out there to counter this threat. But until people do a lot better job of, looking for telltale signs themselves, we may be finding ourselves back to this very scenario again.
So can you talk about that? I mean, you're concerned that you think that this could happen again.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that I've been really big on is getting people to talk a little bit more about. In the Air Force, we have a saying in the security world that every airman is a sensor. That means every person that wears a uniform has the capability of alerting other people, other authorities to potential terrorist acts as they occur. What we know about terrorism and what we know about a lot of things, if this is in fact terrorism, is that there are certain attack indicators or things that are out there that have classically told us or historically have told us that these events are going to be taking place, or someone is planning to take these events under their own fruition. And I think that we have to do a better job of telling our population what those indicators are. We've talked about people who take pictures everywhere, or we've talked about people who look suspicious. But there's some things that I think close friends and family members need to take note of as well. you may want to take note of the fact that a person has changed their worldview completely over time, or drastically due to a historical event. You may want to take note of the fact that they ostracized themselves away from any human contact, which these people didn't do. But they did do the first thing. Um, there are other pre-attack indicators that you may want to recognize. I mentioned radicalization. Um, you know, the brothers almost mentioned radicalization that he saw them with coming into contact with. That's something that we need to do a better job with. I think we also need to educate our populace on something that's really important about radicalization, and that's that it's a journey. It's not a switch. It's not like you see a bombing and then suddenly you're going to strap a suicide on your chest. That's not how it works. It's a process, and we need to do a better job of recognizing that process and mitigating that before it gets to this point.
Right. Right. So, how ultimately are people going to prevent something? How are you going to be able to prevent something like this from happening again? I mean, the idea I think people will say is that if someone can, if some younger kids, a 19-year-old, can pull this off, one's got to wonder how much more savvy, let's say terrorists, what they would be able to perform. And so, let's say you being in the military or, discharged now, but like having been in the military, what are your suggestions in terms of how to prevent this from happening again? Or is it kind of inevitable based on the world we live in now?
Max, you touched on something that I think is very important to discuss, and that's that there is a misconception about security. Bear with me for a little bit, but oftentimes in security or with the public, they believe that security is something that they can touch, it's something that they can grasp. So if you tell them that we've provided security, they assume that you're preventing the attacks. You're preventing bad guys from coming. And the truth of the matter is that it's not a matter of when an attack, not a matter of if an attack occurs. It's when it occurs. Because everything you do up until then, you have there's no correlation between an absence of a violent attack, things you've done, and the things that you may not have done. For instance, we often lock our doors in our homes, right? Because we assume that stops bad guys from coming in our home. No direct relation that bad guys have ever touched the door in our house to enter in to begin with. But we lock our doors truthfully because in the event that an attacker does come, that will stop them. Now, unfortunately, what we know about attackers is that a lock on the door won't stop them if they really want to come and get you. And that's something that we have a hard time dealing with, and we have a hard time recognizing. That's not to say that we shouldn't have protective measures. I just believe that we need to adapt protective measures that are more proactive and less reactive, and that actually work towards concrete evidence about what attackers will do when faced with conventional defensive measures. Like, for instance, if you're going to have dogs walking a 26.2 mile area, and I don't know a lot about working with the working dogs except for my experience in the Air Force, but if you're going to have covering that stretch of an area, it would behoove you to have an additional layer of body detection of the dogs, because what we learned is that these individuals saw the dogs leave a specific area, and that's the area that they encamped in. And so what we should probably look at doing is perhaps switching that up, having another second dog team come through after that dog team is already swept, and that's difficult to do with such a large area. That's something else that that we often haven't discussed in this is that the security environment for 26.2 miles is unfathomable to even begin to have some semblance of what the public considers security. What you
Right.
can do is do what Boston PD and others had done, which was have protective measures in place, defensive measures in place, drills in place, so that if and when the attacker does come, you're prepared, not necessarily toward prevention. Because if you wanted to prevent it, there's one simple way that you can prevent an attack at 26.2 miles. You let no one in the area. But unfortunately, it's a marathon, so you can't do that. So, unfortunately, there is no prevention that's going to work. The best thing we can do, again, is to turn everyone on to the fact that there are people out there in our culture and in our society who we could be losing, and we need to turn our eyes and ears towards that. And I'm not saying you need to turn every one of your relatives into Homeland Security or anything crazy like that, but I think it's necessary that we have a discussion that's more fruitful, and that you should be looking for everybody that wears a hijab or a kafaya, because they're going to be terrorists. Like we've learned with Newton and we've learned with everywhere else that we've had mass shooting attacks, is that it could really be anybody. We still don't know the cause of this bombing. This bombing could in fact be, a mass murder situation and not necessarily a terrorist action.
Right. So, what's your sort of what's your response to the people who, let's say, are, well, first off, because we're on the subject, would you mind talking about then what sort of real solutions you do see working? I know you brought up some stuff regarding bomb sniffing dogs, but in terms of securing the borders here at home, I mean, once again, you have the military background. Can you kind of touch on maybe any ideas you've ever come up with, or something like I've thought about, internal security here at home? How would that process work, or how is it enhanced?
Yeah, actually, I can. When dealing with any security environment, you tailor it towards the more probable threat. I could protect my home against an incursion of Navy SEALs. If I really wanted to, I could do that. I consider that to be a secure environment. But I could also be undermined by someone who's friendly to me into my own home, and they could walk out with everything if I'm not prepared for that as being the more probable threat. So in terms of home security, what I've always recommended that people do is that they examine for themselves the area they live in, the type of threat they will receive, and the kind of protective measures that make sense for their environment. For instance, you probably don't need a wrought iron fence in suburban America. You probably don't need a large fence with barbed wire in the middle of the country. But you probably do need that in some other areas. There, in terms of our national security, in terms of the things I think that would enhance our protective measures in terms of homeland security, I think that one of the things that we could do a lot better is by addressing two things. One, our appetite for violence. We don't talk about that a lot, but I think that's semi-practical.
Do you think that
in this country we have an overgrowing desire to mitigate?
Do you think, in regards to that violence concept, we hold a lot of discussions, for example, on gun control and stuff, and people talk about a violence conflict here in the U.S. So, is that something that you see a serious problem with? Our culture is just too violent.
I do see violence in our culture as a problem. I think that we have this innate desire to resolve everything um, through violence, through some means, and sometimes violence is necessary. I fashioned my entire career off of using violence to resolve certain international conflicts. So I don't necessarily negate the necessity of violence. What I have an issue with is that in terms of interpersonal conflicts, we have sort of gotten rid of that the citizen has no attachment to government. They no longer see themselves as a part of the government and more or less a victim of it. In some circles, now mainstream, that's not necessarily the case, but in certainly other circles where this sort of mentality exists, it further detaches people from the community and it causes people to believe that violence is the only resolution because it's quick, fast, and easy, and they think that that'll solve it. As we know, it only complicates things for them and for everyone else. Um, so, yeah, I totally believe that. And by no means am I a tree hugger or anything crazy like that, but I do believe that we have a big problem with violence in this country, and we need to talk about it. I'm not a I do not believe that regulation is the way to go in terms of mitigating that violence. In other words, I don't think it's a conversation that our government needs to have. It's more or less it's a conversation that every individual home owner and every individual citizen needs to have with themselves and with their family.
Great. So, what do you think really takes place next? I mean, what are your feelings on what needs to happen next in terms of like next step? And I guess we can take the discussion in a few different routes, but I guess next steps in terms of security, right? What are your thoughts on that? Securing the nation.
I think we can go a lot of different places with securing the nation. With securing the nation, I think that there are a few steps that we can go take us a little bit more into the future. I definitely believe that we have become a little bit too reliant on our security. We believe that our security can solve all issues. I think that we need to take a little bit away from the technology piece. Still use it to augment us and find ways to make it better. But we need to get back to critical thinking. We need to start thinking about these particular security issues like homegrown terrorism, like international terrorism, like anything else. We need to start thinking critically. We need to think about the things that happen in our space that will alert us to these things. One of the things that I also think is important for us is that we stop. We have to understand the nature of the war that we're in when it comes to terrorism, and we need to understand that it's not going to have a uniform. Our enemy's not going to have a uniform. They're not going to have a flag necessarily. Many of them will only wave the flag of their cause. Many of them do not even understand their own cause. We need to have some sort of cultural and historical context before we label threats. Just because someone wears a compliant job doesn't necessarily mean they're an enemy of the state. It just means that they, that they belong to a particular culture or have a particular belief. Now, does that change once they espouse radical ideas and support violence? Of course, we do need to have a conversation. Particularly, you see it with regards to this situation with the Boston Marathon bombers. There's this whole conversation about, well, if they're Chechens, then they're definitely terrorists. And it doesn't take into consideration the fact that these guys might just be two murdering, suspects and nothing else. That they could just be in this for the spree. They could just be in it for the violence. There are things that are missing that we would expect to see for someone who is making a political statement, like a manifesto, like a letter. We haven't had that yet. I think that's very important. I think that's in the back of a lot of counterterrorist binds right now, I think, and that's part of the discussion that's going on with them, even through social media. I think we also need to have a conversation about, um, in taking us to the next step forward, is using social media a lot more constructively in these events. I was very pleased with the way you matriculated to Twitter. I thought that that was a very good form. It's a little difficult sometimes to wade through all the trough and the garbage or whatever, what they call intelligence for rumor intelligence. But nonetheless, it was good to see that. I think.
Well, now you have Vonvo too. So
I was very pleased with the way. I'm sorry. Say again.
I said now you have Vonvo too for people to discuss this topic.
Yes, actually, yes. It's I was it's funny you mentioned that. I'm always curious, and I like the way social media like Vonvo is coming along because it allows people an opportunity to discuss ideas. And I think I was very pleased with the fact that you're running through all your videos says that we have to be a little bit more constructive and less what I call destructive when it comes to our criticisms and critiques of other people's ideas. And I think that's a good part. I think that's a good transformation of the social media dialogue. Um, we witnessed in 2012 how that could slide and how that could degrade the purpose of having constructive discourse. And so, Vonvo and the nature of the dialogue and having a moderator, I think, is it's beyond helpful towards having a really good, meaningful discussion.
Yep, and I'm sorry that once again I'm sorry that we had those 2 cancellations. Otherwise, you need to have a few other people joining you, and you'd really get an even better sense of how the platform's been working. But no big deal. I have an interesting question that I would ask you to address, and that is for, let's say, those Muslims that are out there that are concerned about these 2 individuals and basically having these explosives and doing what they did. It's going to continue to give, let's say, them a bad rap and and then ultimately it's going to it can turn into more violence, let's say, here in the U.S. against Muslims who are kind of being put under the same umbrella as these people. What are your thoughts in regards to that concept?
I totally think that that's a very legitimate concern. It's particularly after September 11th, we saw a lot of violence against Muslims just because they were Muslims or because they looked like Muslims. I remember the thing that people had with Sikhs versus Muslims, and there were a lot of Sikhs who were attacked. And that's something that I believe is a very legitimate concern. And I think that's something that is a part of our social media discourse. We need to have a little bit more constructive dialogue with regards to it.
Great. Malika, are you there? Scriven, do you hear Malika? Hey, Scriven, are you there?
I do not. I see a blur, but I don't hear her. No.
Yeah, I don't hear her either. Malika, if you could just get your audio fixed. I don't know if you have headphones or a microphone on your computer, but if you get that fixed, that would be great. Okay, so she's saying in the text chat that she's going to try and get her thing fixed. So the next question I would ask you about is, and we semi touched on it briefly. Um, what are your thoughts on the media's handling of the topic?
I'm sorry, you got broken up just a tad bit. Can you say that again?
I asked what was your what's your take on the media's handling of this topic and their coverage of it?
Uh, wow, I'm glad you asked that. That's it's been a very frustrating part for a lot of for many of me and my colleagues. There's been a uh, you know I I think a lot of times we've lost a little bit of perspective. I think that we've come pretty hard on CNN because they've been inaccurate. But I think in these scenarios it can be kind of difficult, um, to get a lot of good information that you have that much time to fact check and understand. For instance, we have forgotten the fact that while CNN was trying to report on this and trying to get information, there were bombs and explosives and people being shot. And there was a lot of things that happened in that span that make, when that stuff happens on the streets of America, very difficult to get accurate. And so there was a lot of confusion. You had a lot of news agencies trying to scoop each other, which I think there's just going to be a lot of bad news reported inaccurately, just given the nature of of the beast, I guess you could say. I think one of the biggest caveats that I would like to see change, though, is 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 the is the reliance on mainstream your news source. I think that there's a lot more that you can get factually off of social media sites like Vonvo, like Twitter, like Facebook. And people laugh when I say that, but for instance, I had friends who were on the ground that were tweeting things that were going on that CNN and Fox didn't have access to. There's also an ability for those who are in the quote unquote the know to be able to send out documents or factual data to correlate what the news is reporting, and that's very helpful. Um, in terms of social media critiques, I would have is that there was a belief system that we could out sleuth the federal agencies, and so we had internet users who were trying to zoom in on pictures. Who didn't really understand the science behind imagery analysis. They didn't understand the nature of how security contractors operate. So they assumed that because we had a contractor that was out on the ground, this is one that you'll hear propagated by InfoWars and other sites, is that there was this huge conspiracy that because the FBI and because all these people were out there practicing for an event like this, and that an event occurred, that must mean that there was in fact an attack. And we also had photographs of the security contractors who were working the site, who were doing what I can only assume was surveillance and was trying to give a human intelligence component for law enforcement. Guys walking around on cell phones, picking out suspicious people for law enforcement to pick up. Like I said, 26.2 miles is a lot of ground to cover. We don't have enough law enforcement officers to cover that much ground with that many people. So they contracted out. That happens a lot. But in the social media context, that's reported totally different because people just have a lack of understanding. But that becomes news to people who are further detached from the world. And unfortunately, it takes away the credibility of law enforcement agencies and emergency managers who are trying to get this done on the ground.
Right. All right, great. So let's see here. Was there any other? I'm not. I'm just scrolling through the text chat. and not seeing any specific questions to raise to you, was there any other specific things that you wanted to speak about by any chance? We have a couple more minutes, and I have to actually go and record a different discussion on a different topic. But are there any other subjects you wanted to cover regarding this Boston bombing?
Yeah, the, just thought I would caution anybody who's listening and watching today, to ensure that we have a very fruitful discussion about all the different facets of the nuclear bombing. That includes the the way the FBI handled things, the way the local police handle things, to our reporting, to kinds of things that we assume should happen in this particular situation. Again, we don't know if this is a terrorist act, so there will be debate, there will be conjecture, there will be speculation, but until it comes from a good source, I would caution people to be patient and do their due diligence, because there are people even in those circles who say they have your best interests that unfortunately do not. And so I would caution everyone just to be patient and kind of wait until they get some further guidance and some further information regarding these two suspects, or one suspect who's deceased and the other who's now in custody. But that's pretty much all I have for right now. I appreciate you having me, Max.
Right, and no problem. What I was going to say is Malika posted a question about how, after this tragedy, do you feel we can build relationships and support American Muslims? And Malika is an American Muslim, so how would you suggest that takes place with the tragedy that just happened?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I saw that. She asks, how do you feel we can build support? How do you feel we can build relationships and support for American Muslims? And that's a very good question. And to be really honest with you, I think we're going to have to. We have done a really poor job of explaining Islam to the American population, and that's really sad, because it's become such an integral part of the 21st century. Um, and I think it could be something that could very well define this, unfortunately. Um, so how we can build better relationships um, is very complex, but very simple also. I think, not every Muslim holds these radical beliefs. Not everyone who is a Muslim, um, who espouses these beliefs, has ever read the Quran. A lot of people that we found, um, you know, never read the Quran. They were told what the Quran had said, and so therefore they went out and attacked people. That is a fact of life. They were radicalized by people who either read the Quran and misinterpreted things, or interpreted things for their own gain. But that doesn't get translated very well. Um, there's also this misguided belief that all Muslims want to destroy America, and that's not necessarily the case. There are Muslims who do want to destroy America, just like there are Christians who would like to destroy what is considered modern America. Um, and that ideology isn't exclusive to a religion as much as it is to people who hold these beliefs. I often tell people that if you take all the hate literature and all the hate websites that are out there, and take a close examination of them, it looks like they've been printed off the same printing press. I mean, the enemies of their enemies is always the same. Their ideology is pretty much the same. The end result that they seek is really the same. Um, and yet in each circumstance, we say they're an isolated few, they're an isolated few. But it seems as though Islam is the one religion, the one political ideology or facet of a political ideology that we've seemed to believe that is totally, all the way corrupt. We haven't waged a war on evangelical Christians who are extremely right to the point of joining white supremacist groups. We haven't done that. We won't even entertain that as a discussion. But that's how we treat Islam, which is totally different. And so we've forgotten that. And I think that the way we can do away with that is by having discussions about Islam and what Islam is, and understanding that there's some complexity involved in that, and that we've played a key role in why that's so complex. And I think we just need to have a very frank and honest discussion about it.
Right. All right, great. So Scriven, what I was going to say is thank you so much for participating today, and we'll definitely look to have you back on the platform in the coming weeks to speak about this subject and others. And thankfully we got some audience members to listen in on you, and we'll hopefully not have as many cancellations next time. Subject and others. Thankfully we got some audience
members. Yeah, it's been a really fascinating topic to discuss, and again, I appreciate Paul. Thanks for having me, Max.
No problem. Our pleasure. We'll speak to you very soon, okay? Thank you so much.